Good morning. This is a kind of an introduction to, in my mind, one of the best slave narratives available for the 18th century. This is just an introduction to the interesting narrative of the life of Olaudah Equiano. Equiano's dates, you can see there, 1745 to 1797. There's some ambiguity and actually pretty hot scholarly debate as to the first part of his life, but we've got good sources from when he was about 10 years of old, and so we're pretty confident for most of his life. Why is this book significant? In my mind, it's the best book on the slave trade in the 18th century by someone who is a participant in it and a witness of it. We have really fine slave narratives of American slaves like Frederick Douglass and Harriet Jacobs in the 19th century, who primarily are trying to get from the American South into the North and to freedom. But this is a book that I think really situates slavery nicely in its Atlantic context. It's also a book that sort of raises questions about the relationship between slavery and race, and about the ability, whether or not there's in my profession, in the history profession, there's a debate that's been around for at least a century, which is the kind of a chicken and egg debate. Which comes first, slavery or racism? Because each of these seems to profoundly influence the other. And then finally, I think this is a great book about the modern self and creating the modern self, because Equiano has to sort of take all of the different pieces of his story from all of the different parts of the empire in which he lives and forge a kind of a religious sense of who he is, and an economic sense of who he is, and a cultural sense of who he is. And scholars, at least Ira Berlin, who was one of my teachers from the University of Maryland, professor about slavery in the Atlantic world, Berlin taught Equiano as this word that you might never have heard of. The word is a Creole, right? Creole comes from the Spanish. It meant, in the context of the Caribbean originally, someone who is from Spain but was either born in the Caribbean or had spent so much time in the Caribbean that they developed this sort of American identity. And it's a hybrid, right? People living in this Atlantic world come from three different races. They're natives, or they're Africans, or they're Europeans. And so to be a Creole was to sort of be a citizen of the Atlantic, and to not be fully at home in one place, but be able to move fluidly from one place to another. Now, I think that's actually a significant part of what it means to be an individual in the modern world. And so one of the ideas I'd ask you to sort of think about is whether or not Equiano might be more modern, have a more fluid sense of identity than either people certainly in his ancestral homeland of what's today Nigeria, but also maybe in, say, a village in Cornwall in England. So my goal is to kind of briefly kind of give you a sense of his life, and then talk about some of the different kinds of slavery that emerge in the story, so that you recognize them when you see them, and give you some discussion questions to provoke you toward a good conversation later in the week. All right, so Olaudah is usually the way it's pronounced, Equiano. Was born in probably 1745. I think he was born in he tells us, a town called Isiki, to the Igbo people in Nigeria. He works first for his family, but after a few years he's kidnapped and sold as a trade slave, where he's apprenticed and travels around kind of West Africa. And this doesn't seem to him to be an especially strange occurrence, because slavery is common in Africa, but it's a sort of trade slavery where you might be a slave and maybe never go back all that far from home. When he's a boy, and we're not sure how old, maybe 6, maybe 10, he's taken to the coast and sold to a trader, probably an English trader, who takes him to Barbados, and he's put up on the auction block in Barbados. And that space between Africa and Barbados is called the Middle Passage. It's a particular kind of moment in the history of slavery. Pay close attention to his description of it, because I think it's one of the best literary descriptions that we have of it. He can't be sold in Barbados. No one's interested in buying him as a boy. They want young men who are able to work in the sugar mills and the plantations, and so he's taken to Virginia, where he's sold. He doesn't spend all that much time in Virginia because he's acquired then by a British captain who intends to use him as a kind of a manservant for him as an officer. And so he spends the next 6 years in the British Navy when the British Navy is sort of in the middle of its World War II, fighting the French for a global empire. The war ends in 1763. He's sold to a Quaker slave owner in the Caribbean. That's a major juxtaposition if you know anything about the Quakers, because later they become fierce abolitionists. But in the 1760s, not so much. His master then uses him to sort of manage interests because he's such a familiar, by this point, he's a sailor, he's a sort of citizen of the Atlantic. So his master uses him to manage trade between the Caribbean and his business dealings in the Carolina. And he's able to acquire, using a little bit of kind of entrepreneurship, he's able to kind of do some private trading on his own, and by 1766 he acquires enough wealth to become to buy his own freedom. And then he sort of moves to England, where he thinks that that's a really interesting choice. Why would you choose to move to England? What does that say about your identity? And takes jobs when he can get them in the Navy, where he can get paid pretty well as a black man, but he'd really rather live in London and kind of dress and enjoy the fancy clothes that you see him wearing there. And that's most of what I think you're going to probably read for our classes. The one chapter I like to pay a lot of attention to, though, later on is chapter 10, which talks about his conversion experience in 1704, and why he chooses to become an evangelical style Christian as opposed to just a baptized Anglican, or as opposed to maybe a Muslim. He wrestles in life, and you should think about this, maybe be ready to talk about it. What would moving to Turkey and living as a free Muslim in Turkey, why would that be attractive to someone like Equiano? So he's not a person of much fame. He seems to have had an unusual life, but his rise to kind of celebrity status happens in 1781 as the result of a really famous case in British law, the Zong case. I'm going to give you the facts and sort of give you a sense of why it was controversial, and this is what motivates Equiano to sort of assume a larger platform in British public life. So Captain Collingwood was the in charge of a slave ship named the Zong. Zong is a sort of a Chinese name for a ship, but it's a British ship. It's owned by British investors. And Collingwood leaves Sao Tome with 440 slaves and a normal. And on this middle passage, you can sort of see a sense of what these slave ships look like. This isn't a cross-section of Zong, but it's a pretty typical one. 440 is far more than a ship like this ought to bear. We would be comfortable with maybe 30 people on the ship, and that would feel crowded to us. So this is not a good voyage from an economic standpoint. 67 of the slaves die of disease. We're not told which diseases in this middle passage. And so when Collingwood gets to the Caribbean, he makes a kind of a cold, brutal business decision that these slaves are going to be worthless on the market because they're sick. No one will buy them. But they're insured because they've been bought at high prices in West Africa. So he makes the decision when he arrives to take 54 of the slaves, to chain them together, and to throw them overboard. The first mate objects strenuously and puts it in the record. And so we have a good account of what happens because the crew is sort of hotly debating. But Collingwood does this, and on the next day, he then drowns 42 more. On day 3, he drowns 36 more. It seems at that point like the epidemic has stopped. So 248 survivors are sold. This is a voyage that would have lost money, but then when he gets back to England, the owners attempt to file an insurance claim. They have to deal with this sort of first mate's testimony that this is in fact murder. The British courts ruled that this is an economic decision, that the cargo was in fact damaged, and that this was not an illegal thing to do. They order that the Zong owners are going to be paid in full. And Equiano is so outraged by this kind of um, offense to human dignity and human life, that he decides that he's going to take his knowledge of the Atlantic and begin to tell people sort of what slavery was really like. Because clearly the British don't understand, clearly the British public doesn't understand. And so Equiano becomes a major force in the British evangelical crusade against slavery, led by people like William Wilberforce. Um, and so that when he publishes his autobiography then in 1789, he's acquired this reputation as a crusader for freedom. Well, let me give you a shift gear here, give you a couple of slides that give you some context about what slavery is like as you kind of think about how the different parts of Equiano's identity are described. So the first thing to talk about here is to sort of have a sense of Equiano's African identity. The Igbo aren't on the map here, but they're a Nigerian tribe, and they would have lived in the interior somewhere about here. You can see my cursor. And so when Equiano was born, he would have conceived of himself as having an Igbo identity. He wouldn't have seen himself as an African any more than you or I probably have an identity as a North American. To have an identity connected to a continent wouldn't have made much sense, and everyone was black and have a strong racial identity in that sense. But then as he kind of comes to the coast and he's sold aboard a British slave trading ship, he's going to move from this space, the Bight of Biafra, into the Middle Passage, and pay attention to the way that he describes identity and language. When he moves into this space, are there people who speak his language? Are there people who know how to communicate? When he finally arrives in Virginia, is there anyone in Virginia who speaks Igbo that he knows? Probably not very many. And so he's going to have to forge a new identity for himself. He's clearly not a part of the Southern planter class, but who is he? And so scholars talk about this as the sort of place where an African or maybe an African American identity is created. I should also say something about the Middle Passage point. Scholars have a great deal of difficulty kind of estimating how many people left Africa. We have better numbers on arrival and manifests in the New World because you can sort of look at shipping manifests and who is sold. We think between 10 and 15 million left the African coast between 1442, when the Portuguese start the slave trade, and the 1870s, when the British are finally successful in suppressing it. Yeah, this is always a hard photo for me. This is a photograph taken by a British naval lieutenant in the 1840s upon the capture of a slave ship. These ships were by this point illegal, and if the British caught the ship, they would capture it, they would set everyone free, they would attempt to take them to Africa. But look at who would be on the deck of the ship, right? The adults would be below the surface, and they would be sort of manacled in these rows, and they would be laid out. They would be crammed into the hold as much as possible. The children would be allowed to run on the deck. So Equiano probably would have experienced this voyage on the deck. And the reason that they did this, it's horrific, but the accounts are really obvious, is that little children don't commit suicide in the same way that the adults would. And so the adults kind of up on the deck would throw themselves overboard to attempt to get back to Africa, or to try to at least have some kind of meaningful death where their souls would return to Africa. And the children wouldn't have an interest in that. So children would be allowed to sort of move on the deck. And so when the British lieutenant comes up, this is sort of what things look like. Now, when Equiano arrives in the Caribbean, he encounters a kind of slavery that he would not have experienced in Africa. So even though slavery existed in the Old World, it wasn't like the slavery that emerged in the slavery that emerges in the New World is dictated by the demands of sugar production. I'm not sure what you had for breakfast. I actually had oatmeal with a lot of sugar on it to make it more palatable. And when Europeans first acquire sugar during the Crusades, they get it from the Arabs living in the Levant. And they acquire a taste for it, and they begin to sort of build sugar plantations on the islands in the Mediterranean that they control. These plantations are created for profit. They're not fundamentally about racism in the late Middle Ages, because most of the people working on the plantation then would have been slaves, yes, but they would have been, the word for slave is actually the word Slav. They would have been white folks from the Balkans or from Russia or from maybe parts of the Islamic world. And so it's an institution that's created for profit. The, the labor demands on the plantation are severe and utterly backbreaking. Equiano gives you some numbers in terms of Barbados and how many people are imported to Barbados. But and unfortunately, my notes are locked in Chamberlain, and I'm kind of doing this off the top of my head. But if memory serves, about 75,000 people are imported in a 15-year period into Barbados in the early 18th century. And there's about 45,000 slaves at Barbados at the beginning and 45,000 slaves at the end. So, Barbados is sort of this mill that's grinding up people who come in, and they work and they produce slaves, and your life expectancy might be 10 years and then you would die. It's a brutal system. It's exploitive. It's incredibly profitable, and your life expectancy is very, very low. Now, and if you're really interested in reading more, here's a nice piece by Philip Curtin. That would, if you ever want to write red paper on this, this is the book I'd recommend. But Equiano doesn't stay in this kind of situation long. He's not that kind of a slave for very long. He's a boy, and he sees this, but doesn't seem to spend much time working in the actual sugar mills, or he would have been worked to death rather rapidly. So something about him sparks the interest, and so he's sold first to a planter in Virginia, and then he's acquired by the captain. So the kind of slavery that Equiano experiences is unusual. He's a sailor, and a kind of gentleman sailor. He's a valet or something aboard one of these British naval vessels. And so his conception of slavery is of all of either the poor white people and the poor black people working together in the hold of the British Navy and the British Merchant Marine, kind of in this traffic all over the Atlantic world. And this is part of what makes this book so interesting, is you can sort of see what the world looked like. This is a travel narrative in some way if you're trying to figure out the genre. So thinking about his identity, he sort of meets all these different people, and he meets the Spanish and the Portuguese and Africans and Spaniards and people in Virginia and people in the Carolinas. And I don't know if you've traveled extensively, but when you travel extensively, you sort of acquire these habits of learning how to fit in different places, right? In different places in my own life. I've lived in London, I've lived in Vermont, I've lived in New York, I've lived in Maryland, I've lived in Idaho. And so depending on where I am, I can sort of acquire an accent. I can learn to slow down my voice and talk more like I'm from Idaho, or I can do this Yankee twang and I can talk like I'm from eastern New Hampshire, and or I mean, depending on where you are, you sort of become a slightly different person. And I sort of imagine Equiano as being like this. He can sort of alter his appearance to kind of fit in where he needs to fit in. So thinking about his travels, and I've excerpted those parts of the book. And then finally, he talks a fair amount about the Carolinas and what's emerging and this is an especially significant part of American history. So let me sort of give you a brief 3-minute lesson on kind of what Equiano describes about the significance of slavery as it emerges. So I said that at the beginning, like maybe in 1400, before the discovery of the New World, slavery exists, but it doesn't seem to be primarily about race. By the time we get to the 19th century and the Civil War in America, slavery seems to be primarily about racism. And so how does that transition take place? We see two kinds of slavery emerge in the Americas, right? About 95% of the slaves who come from Africa are actually taken to Latin America, where they work on these sugar plantations, right? Now, a sugar plantation, like we said, has really high profits. The working conditions are severe. When the sugar is being harvested, it will spoil very rapidly. And so you basically work around the clock, you work till you drop, you worked to death. So mostly it's teenage men and men in their 20s who are hired as slaves in this environment. Boys aren't all that valuable, young women aren't all that valuable. But because this is primarily a male colony, the boundaries between slavery and race are fairly permeable. Very few white women come to Jamaica or Barbados. And so the white men who show up develop these interracial relationships either with Native women or with African women. So you get the emergence of a substantial, this is what Creole originally meant in the Spanish context. Well, no, that's not true. That's what it means by 2 or 3 generations, right? By 1800, this is what Creole means. It means someone who has a mixed race ancestry. Their paternal line goes back and might be Spanish, and their maternal line would be African. And that these are people who were sort of free, who weren't slaves, who were second-class citizens, but who had the ability to sort of operate in this world, and they had a certain kind of freedom, and they generally were the blacksmiths and the traders, and they didn't own the society, but they weren't slaves either. And so there was this sort of middle ground. And if you think about race in Latin America today, I mean, Latin America is a place where we experience significant racism, but it's not as if there's this binary, which is what develops in North America, right? In the Virginia and Carolina societies in which Equiano lived, right? So the place where this develops first is Virginia, where tobacco is the primary crop. Tobacco by the 18th century has a really low profit margin, meaning you can't make much money growing this stuff. You have to grow it carefully. It's more like wine or cheese in terms of the way it's produced. The quality really matters. And so the people who develop the skill of growing tobacco, both white and black, really are more artisanal. And so the labor force becomes really valuable. You can't afford to replace it every generation. And so the slaves become a permanent. So in Virginia, they hire not just men, but they hire women and they hire children and they train them. And so the Virginia slave system as it develops is a system where not only is tobacco a primary economic kind of export, but by the 19th century, Virginia is actually exporting slaves to other parts of the United States, right? And so women are intentionally sort of, this is really crass, this is really immoral, but they conceived of it like a property system, so that women are bred to try to have as many children as possible. If you were going to sell a young woman, you would sell a young woman with a baby as opposed to not having a baby, because if she had a baby, then you could demonstrate that she would be able to have children and investors would be interested in it. And so slavery as it exists in America then is lifelong, and it's chattel based, and Virginia becomes obsessed with what they consider racial relationships. So in Latin America, things that weren't a big deal, in America, you sort of develop this one drop rule, where North America, if you're white, you're white, and if you're black, you're black. And this isn't the subject of Equiano's book, but it's one of the reasons why historians are really interested in it. That he's describing all of these different kinds of slavery, and you can see how the Caribbean style of slavery leads to one kind of culture of race, and what he describes in Virginia would lead to another culture of race. So, all right. So here are my discussion questions for this week, and maybe other people using the video will give you your own discussion questions. But I'm interested in this question of kind of how does Equiano learn what it means to be first African? What are clues that you see reading about how that process might work? Second, how does he sort of learn what it means to be involved in the Atlantic slave economy? He's born in a society with slavery, but it's a different kind of slavery. So how does he learn what it means to be a slave in this environment? And what kinds of freedoms does he have as a naval slave as opposed to a sugar plantation slave? When Equiano gains some control over his identity and over his ability to fashion himself and literally fashion his own hair and fashion his own clothes, why does he choose to be British? Or am I pushing it too far? If you disagree with me, you can push back, right? And think about also the way in which he writes the book. So this book is a kind of self-fashioning. He's choosing the story he wants to tell for a particular purpose. He's an abolitionist by this point. He's trying to present himself as presenting a particular image. He has an agenda. Does the agenda get in the way of his story? Is he telling a certain kind of story because he wants to persuade the reader to become abolitionist too? And in particular, what do you think of this idea that I'm advancing, that he has this Creole identity, that he might be one of the first sort of modern individuals in Atlantic world. So those are the questions at least we'll be discussing in my sections. And if dive into the text, give yourself time to read it. It's complicated. Don't be afraid to take breaks, and don't be afraid to skim over a particular kind of section, especially about the naval career. His naval experiences. He's really a part of their World War II, right? Their great war for empire between the British and the French. And so things that we don't see as relevant at all, like the siege of Louisbourg, might for their readers be like talking about how well, I was at D-Day and I met, General Rommel, and like he has all these famous people he's encountered that we don't remember at all. And that you're in one of those places you can skim a little bit. Well, all right, I look forward to our discussions and I hope to see you virtually soon.